Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Say What podcast. Here with me today, I have Jeff Dyra, who is here to help us understand ESG and how it affects the value of your business. Thank you for being on with me today, Jeff.
Absolutely. No problem, Jill. It's great to be here.
So for our listeners that are unfamiliar with ESG, can you tell us what it is and what it stands for?
ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's basically a tool for socially conscious investors to measure a corporation's environmental impact to determine their investment worthiness, or simply put, if they're going to invest capital into that organization.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. So recently, ESG is being used more and more in the business community. How does it differ from sustainability?
Even though there are some overlaps, there definitely are some distinctions. And I'm going to break them down into three different categories. The first is the relationship between the company and the environment. As a general rule, sustainability describes and measures the relationship between the company and the planet. Meanwhile, ESG is about the relationship between a company and its investors. Although ESG certainly has an environmental component and a benefit to the planet, the driving force behind the adoption of ESG measures is really to attain investment dollars, not necessarily to promote environmental stewardship. Meanwhile, sustainability's main goal is to improve the planet's health. The second fundamental is ESG standards. Sustainability efforts are typically measured using a company's carbon footprint. So these standards are based on science. ESG standards, however, are set by lawmakers and investors and are not science-based. Once again, there are dozens of frameworks for measuring ESG, so there's definitely a lack of congruency or standardization in ESG. The final distinction between ESG and sustainability is economic impact. The role of money is very different between sustainability and ESG. Now, while sustainability efforts may be undertaken by companies to generate goodwill and motivate their customers or prospective customers to buy their product, ESG is undertaken to attract investment dollars. So the point of influence of these two measures is very different.
So if you had to sum it all up for us, what would you say if our listeners are asking themselves, I do not work or own a public or large private company. Why does it matter to me? What would you say to them?
That's a great question. To sum it up, I would say that the difference between sustainability and ESG are substantial, and its efforts are really directed at very different audiences. Because ESG has generally been limited to investment practices of Wall Street, it has been limited to public or very large companies. To the listeners that are out there wondering, why does this matter to me? I'm a small business or a middle-sized organization. It's really important to understand what ESG is and the aspects of a company's operations that are used to measure ESG standards. This is key to determine if you'll soon be affected by ESG efforts.
Just now you mentioned measuring ESG. How exactly is it measured?
ESG standards are tracked by organizing a company's greenhouse gas emissions from three specific areas, and they fall into categories of what's called scopes. Scope 1 falls in the silo of burn, direct emissions from sources owned or controlled by a company. So examples of these direct emissions would include on-site fossil fuel power generator, company-owned vehicle emissions, things of that nature. Scope 2 falls in the silo of buy. These are indirect emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heat, cooling, basically any electricity or natural gas utility purchased from the business. Scope 3 in the final silo falls in this category of other. So this is all the other emissions associated with the company's activities, both up and downstream. An upstream activity would include a company's supply chain, while a downstream would include transporting your product to the marketplace or any emissions resulting from the use of your product. ESG is prioritized from scope 1 reductions first, and then followed by scope 2 and then 3. If you don't work at a public or large company and you think this may not affect you or apply just yet, you really might want to think again. Scope 3's measurement is very broad, and the emissions resulting from activities outside of the company's control means that the focus could eventually fall on you. If your company is part of a supply chain of an ESG measured company, or if you simply use a product of such a company, your actions could be part of this measurement. So just because ESG efforts aren't affecting you now does not mean that you won't be affected sometime in the near future.
So with all that said, what do you think is the most important for our listeners to know today?
Companies that are part of a larger supply chain are looking at ways today to really reduce their own carbon footprint, really being proactive in planning. They may not use ESG measurements specifically, but rather look to lower their own overall carbon footprint in case they are subject to future ESG mandates required or asked by or from their own customers or business partners. Recent activities at both the state and federal level are making it economically attractive to undertake emission reduction efforts today. These opportunities, coupled with the recent high prices of both electricity and natural gas, make emission reduction efforts not only prudent, but also cost effective. For some examples of these at the state level, it might be solar rebates or efficiency funds. And at the federal level, these are really fall in the category of tax incentives for renewables.
I think it's safe to say I learned a lot today, and I hope our listeners did as well. If our listeners want to learn more about how to get started, who should they contact?
They can reach out to our office and speak to one of our strategic advisors, and we'd be happy to sit down with them and put together a plan suitable for their business.
Thank you, Jeff, for being here with me today, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next Say What podcast.